On June 10, 2014, fighters from the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria rolled into Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, in a convoy of pickup trucks. The Iraqi army, despite outnumbering them by orders of magnitude, collapsed and fled. Within hours, ISIS controlled a city of 2 million people, an arsenal of US-supplied military equipment abandoned by retreating soldiers, and something that would prove more consequential than any of it, the Mosul branch of the Central Bank of Iraq. What ISIS removed from that bank, variously estimated at between $400 and $500 million in Iraqi dinars and foreign currency, was not the beginning of its financial story. It was the moment that confirmed what analysts tracking the group had already begun to suspect. ISIS was not a terrorist organization with a budget, it was a state with an army, and it was building a financial architecture to match. At its territorial peak in 2014 and 2015, the Islamic State controlled a contiguous territory roughly the size of the United Kingdom, spanning eastern Syria and northwestern Iraq, with a population of somewhere between 6 and 8 million people. It was collecting taxes, it was paying salaries. It was running courts, hospitals, schools, and a currency exchange system. Its annual revenue at peak is estimated by the United States Treasury to have exceeded $1 billion, making it at that moment the wealthiest terrorist organization in recorded history, by a margin that made every comparable group look like a local operation. Understanding where that money came from, how it moved, and why it was eventually destroyed requires understanding something that most coverage of ISIS overlooked. The group's financial sophistication was not accidental. ISIS had access to experienced financial administrators from Saddam Hussein's disbanded Ba'athist state, former Iraqi army officers who understood how to run a command economy, and detailed ideological texts that prescribed precise rules for taxation, resource extraction, and wealth distribution in a caliphate. The ISIS treasury was not improvised, it was designed. The largest single revenue source, and the one that distinguished ISIS from every previous terrorist organization, was oil. At peak, ISIS controlled roughly 60 oil fields across Syria and Iraq, including some of the most productive fields in eastern Syria, the Omar field, the Tanak field, the Conoco gas plant near Deir ez-Zor. The group produced somewhere between 30,000 and 45,000 barrels of oil per day. It did not sell this oil on international markets through anything resembling a conventional commodity transaction. It sold it at deep discounts, typically 20 to 40% below market price, to a network of local traders, truck drivers, and intermediaries who moved it across borders into Turkey, Jordan, and Kurdish-controlled territory. Turkish refiners and traders, some operating with at least the tacit knowledge of Turkish border authorities, processed significant volumes. Syrian regime buyers, the government that ISIS was simultaneously fighting, also purchased ISIS oil when supply constraints and price incentives made it rational to do so. At peak revenue, ISIS was earning somewhere between $1 and $3 million per day from oil alone. The second major revenue stream was taxation. ISIS ran a comprehensive fiscal system across its territory. It collected jizya, the traditional Islamic tax on non-Muslim minorities, from Christian, Yazidi, and other religious communities in its territory, at rates that varied but consistently represented a significant extraction from already vulnerable populations. It collected income taxes from all working adults in its territory, typically at rates between 5 and 10% of declared income, enforced through a network of financial police who could demand documentation of earnings. It collected customs duties at every internal checkpoint and external border crossing it controlled, taxing every truck, every shipment, every trader who needed to move goods through its territory. It levied a 20% tax on all agricultural production. It charged fees for utilities, for vehicle registration, for access to telecommunications. The ISIS fiscal state was not a crude extraction operation. It was a functioning, if brutal, government revenue system that generated, by Treasury estimates, somewhere between $300 and $600 million annually at peak. The degree of administrative formality that ISIS brought to its fiscal operations is worth pausing on. Captured ISIS documents, seized by coalition forces and analyzed by researchers including the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, reveal a financial bureaucracy of unexpected sophistication. ISIS maintained a central treasury, the Diwan al-Mal, which received revenues from all provincial administrations and dispersed funds to operational departments according to a formal budget process. Provincial financial officers filed monthly reports documenting revenues collected, expenses incurred, and surpluses transferred to the center. Fighter salaries were paid on a standardized scale, varying by rank, marital status, and number of dependents, and were documented in payroll records that ISIS's accountants maintained with the care of a mid-sized corporation. When ISIS administrators discovered fraud or embezzlement, they convened formal investigations and issued written judgments. The organization that Western governments spent years describing as medieval barbarians was running, on its financial side, something closer to a colonial revenue administration. A third revenue stream was looting, conducted at institutional scale. When ISIS captured a city or town, it did not simply plunder at random. It sent designated units, operating under the authority of a formal administrative department called the Diwan Arikaz, the Office of Natural Resources, to systematically catalog and seize valuable assets. Banks were emptied. Government buildings were stripped of equipment, agricultural machinery was confiscated and either used or resold, factories were assessed for their production capacity and either absorbed into the ISIS economic system or dismantled. The Mosul bank seizure was the most dramatic single instance of this systematic looting, but it was replicated at smaller scale across hundreds of captured communities. The fourth revenue stream was antiquities. The territory ISIS controlled in Syria and Iraq contains some of the densest concentrations of ancient human civilization on earth: Assyrian cities, Mesopotamian temples, Bronze Age trading posts. ISIS's official position was that pre-Islamic idolatry was forbidden and that ancient artifacts should be destroyed. Its actual practice was considerably more pragmatic. ISIS issued licenses to approved excavators, local diggers who paid a 20% khums tax on whatever they found, and allowed the resulting artifacts to flow through its territory toward Turkish dealers and ultimately into the international antiquities market. UNESCO and investigative journalists documented the sale of artifacts from sites including Palmyra, Nimrud, and Apamea through dealers in Turkey, Lebanon, and Europe. The total value of antiquities revenue is the most disputed figure in the ISIS financial record. Estimates range from tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars, but what is not disputed is that the trade was organized, taxed, and permitted by the ISIS administration. The fifth revenue stream was kidnapping for ransom. ISIS held dozens of Western hostages at various points, and while it executed a number of them in videos that became global news events, it also released others in exchange for payments that governments officially denied making. European governments, particularly France, Spain, and several others, are documented to have paid ransoms, directly or through intermediaries that in some cases reached tens of millions of dollars per hostage group. The US and UK governments maintained official no-concessions policies, but the gap between policy and practice in other Western governments represented a significant revenue line for the organization. The way ISIS moved money is as instructive as how it earned it. The group operated almost entirely outside the formal global banking system. This was partly necessity. No financial institution would knowingly process ISIS transactions, but also deliberate doctrine. ISIS explicitly prohibited its administrators from using the conventional banking system on religious grounds and for operational security reasons. Money moved through hawala, the trust-based informal transfer system that we have examined in this series, through physical cash couriers who traveled across borders, and through a network of front businesses in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon that mixed ISIS revenue with legitimate trade flows. The group used cryptocurrency marginally and experimentally, but never at the scale that was sometimes claimed in media coverage. Bitcoin transactions were traceable in ways that cash couriers were not, and ISIS financial administrators were sophisticated enough to understand this. The destruction of the ISIS financial system was a deliberate campaign that preceded and in some ways enabled the military defeat. The US Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, working with coalition intelligence agencies, mapped the oil distribution network and identified the key nodes, the truck fleets, the oil collection points, the specific intermediaries that made the system work. The coalition then conducted a systematic bombing campaign targeting oil infrastructure, refineries, tanker trucks, oil wells themselves. Between late 2015 and 2016, ISIS oil revenue fell by an estimated 50%. Simultaneously, the recapture of territory reduced the tax base, the looting opportunities, and the controlled resources available to the ISIS fiscal system. By 2017, ISIS's annual revenue had fallen to somewhere between $200 and $300 million, still a staggering figure for a terrorist organization, but insufficient to maintain the administrative and military apparatus of a functioning state. The legacy of the ISIS financial system extends beyond ISIS itself. The detailed financial records captured from ISIS administrative centers have become the most comprehensive dataset ever obtained from inside a terrorist financing operation, and they have fundamentally changed how intelligence agencies model the financial behavior of non-state armed groups. The lesson was not simply that ISIS was rich. The lesson was that territorial control, even in impoverished and conflict-devastated regions, generates sufficient economic activity to fund a sophisticated military and administrative organization, if the organization is willing to tax and extract with sufficient systematism and without the constraints of international legal accountability. What the ISIS Treasury ultimately revealed was a proof of concept that no one had previously demonstrated at this scale, that a non-state actor, operating entirely outside the global financial system using informal transfer mechanisms, commodity smuggling, and territorial resource extraction, could generate sufficient revenue to build and sustain a proto-state for years. The tools ISIS used, hawala, oil smuggling, taxation of controlled populations, looting of physical assets, are not exotic innovations. They are ancient mechanisms of extraction and transfer that predate the modern financial system by centuries. What ISIS demonstrated was that the modern financial system's surveillance and interdiction capabilities, powerful as they are, have a hard boundary at the edge of the territory and population the financial system does not reach. And in the ungoverned spaces beyond that boundary, money can still be made, moved, and weaponized at state scale.